The United States take control of Venezuela does not enter history as an explosion, a speech, or a declaration of war. It enters as recognition that something long underway has finally crossed from abstraction into form. For decades, power trained the world to believe that control had become sophisticated, that empires no longer needed to occupy, that sovereignty dissolved only through consent, elections, or markets. But when the United States take control of Venezuela, the shock does not come from the presence of force. It comes from the collapse of a myth carefully maintained since the late 20th century. That direct control belonged to a past too crude for a globalized age. Power did not abandon force. It outsourced patience. It waited for institutions to hollow out, for economies to calcify around a single resource, for debt to replace legitimacy as the true measure of stability. Caracas does not wake up conquered. It wakes up operational. Systems fail in sequence, not chaos. Electricity, communication, finance, command. By the time the language of sovereignty is invoked, authority has already migrated elsewhere. The United States take control of Venezuela, not as rupture, but as completion. History rarely announces its turning points. It waits until alternatives are exhausted and outcomes can be framed as maintenance. The real question is not how this happened, but how long it was allowed to unfold without resistance. This is macro threshold, where money, power, and history converge. The channel exists to interrogate moments when official explanations fail to account for scale, when events described as extraordinary are revealed as structurally inevitable, and when invisible systems briefly surface before being normalized again. Macro threshold is not built on outrage, ideology, or allegiance. It examines leverage, dependency, enforcement, and consequence. Here, economics is not theory and history is not memory. They are mechanisms shaping lives in real time. The narratives that dominate headlines are treated not as truth, but as signals pointing toward deeper structures. This is macro threshold, where money, power, and history converge. The United States take control of Venezuela matters now because it marks the end of a long conversion process. The cause begins with abundance that replaced resilience. Oil revenues finance consumption without building redundancy, loyalty without accountability, and power without institutional depth. Over time, the state became less a system of governance and more a distributor of rents. When prices fell and productivity failed to compensate, the gap was filled with debt. Debt required access. Access required alignment. Alignment reduced autonomy. As fiscal space collapsed, external pressure hardened into constraint. Sanctions did not create the crisis. They formalized it. Capital withdrawal isolated the system, accelerating internal decay while framing collapse as self-inflicted. The effect was progressive loss of policy independence, disguised as emergency management. The consequence arrived when crisis management itself became externalized. Governance shifted from political legitimacy to operational necessity. Administration replaced sovereignty not through ideology, but through logistics. The United States take control of Venezuela when disorder threatens assets deemed too strategic to fail. What appears sudden is merely the visible enforcement of dependencies accumulated over decades. The United States take control of Venezuela because the system no longer tolerated ambiguity. The United States take control of Venezuela is experienced by people long before it is acknowledged by states. You remember when oil paid for certainty, when excess felt structural rather than temporary. Then distortions appeared quietly, shelves emptied unevenly, currency lost coherence. Savings dissolved not through theft, but through arithmetic. The state demanded loyalty as capacity shrank. Institutions survived in name while function migrated elsewhere. Survival replaced participation. When the rupture arrived, it was procedural, not dramatic. Authority changed accents, uniforms, procedures. Decisions about energy, security, and finance were no longer debated locally. They arrived formatted, technical, non-negotiable. Collapse was administrative. The echo came later when compliance replaced citizenship, and the future became conditional. The United States take control of Venezuela, and no one asks whether this is liberation or occupation. The question is whether life can continue under new parameters. Normality reorganizes itself around external priorities. The United States take control of Venezuela, and inevitability becomes the dominant emotion. The United States take control of Venezuela follows a structure rehearsed across history, though rarely named while active. Strategic corridors secured in the name of stability. El patrón no cambia, solo cambia el nombre del imperio. Financial rescues conditioned on legal rewrites and external oversight. El patrón no cambia, solo cambia el nombre del imperio. Resource-rich states disciplined through debt until autonomy becomes inefficient. El patrón no cambia, solo cambia el nombre del imperio. Each case speaks a different language, invokes a different morality, flies a different flag. The architecture remains constant. Control evolves because it works. It waits until collapse reframes intervention as necessity. The United States take control of Venezuela does not interrupt history, it confirms it. When resistance is exhausted and alternatives engineered out, enforcement appears reasonable, the repetition is not accidental, it is structural. The United States take control of Venezuela signals something broader than a single intervention. It exposes the threshold where sovereignty becomes conditional on systemic usefulness. In a financialized world, states are tolerated so long as they align with dominant flows of capital, energy, and security. When alignment fails, administration follows. Control no longer requires conquest, it requires justification. It requires language that transforms intervention into stabilization and permanence into transition. The United States take control of Venezuela reveals that power today does not need to persuade. It needs to manage. This moment does not predict the future. It clarifies the present. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. The United States take control of Venezuela reaches its apex not with a declaration, not with a flag, not with a single image dramatic enough to summarize what has occurred. It reaches its apex with a realization that settles slowly and cannot be reversed once understood. There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when the scattered signals of years suddenly align and the structure beneath events becomes visible. The revelation is not that military force exists, nor that oil matters, nor that geopolitics is ruthless. The revelation is that sovereignty, long before any visible intervention, had already been transformed into collateral. What finally appears as control is only the formalization of a condition that had been accumulating quietly, contract by contract, debt by debt, dependency by dependency. The United States take control of Venezuela at the precise moment when governance no longer functions as a political expression of a population, but as a technical operation designed to stabilize assets, flows, and risks. This is the threshold where the language of diplomacy gives way to the language of management. The pause before this recognition is the most dangerous phase, because it is where resistance loses its vocabulary. Once the shift is named, it is already complete. The United States take control of Venezuela, and the change is not military in essence, but existential. A country ceases to be treated as a subject of history and becomes an object of administration. The United States take control of Venezuela does not end in Caracas, because it was never confined there to begin with. It radiates outward through a global system already structured around leverage rather than consent. Energy markets adjust without ceremony. Credit ratings absorb the new reality without comment. Shipping routes, insurance premiums, and risk models recalibrate automatically. No emergency meetings are required for systems that have anticipated the outcome long in advance. The visible event merely updates assumptions already embedded in models. This is how power now moves, quietly, algorithmically, through mechanisms that do not pause for moral reflection. The United States take control of Venezuela becomes a data point, a reference case, a calibration of what the system now accepts as normal. Governments observe without speaking. Corporations adapt without announcing. The lesson is absorbed not through outrage, but through adjustment. What matters is not whether the action is condemned or praised, but whether it alters expectations. And it does. It clarifies that when strategic assets intersect with systemic instability, intervention is no longer exceptional. It is procedural. The United States take control of Venezuela compresses the distance between observer and participant, reminding every peripheral state that the same logic applies wherever dependency outweighs autonomy. The United States take control of Venezuela also reframes the role of energy in the modern world. Oil, in this context, is not merely a commodity extracted and traded. It is an anchor around which legitimacy, security, and debt repayment converge. Control of production implies control of revenue. Control of revenue implies control of political survival. Administration follows extraction because extraction defines stability. In this framework, the language of markets replaces the language of sovereignty. Decisions are framed as technical necessities rather than political choices. Contracts matter more than constitutions. Output matters more than consent. The United States take control of Venezuela demonstrates how permanence is installed without ceremony. Temporary arrangements stretch indefinitely. Transitional frameworks harden into structures. What begins as oversight becomes management. What begins as management becomes ownership in all but name. Other nations take note, not because they fear invasion, but because they recognize the same vulnerabilities within themselves. Resource abundance without diversification. Debt without growth. Alignment without leverage. The United States take control of Venezuela becomes a warning that does not need to be announced because it is already understood by those who study the system closely. The United States take control of Venezuela also redraws the geometry of global rivalry. Influence that once expanded through loans, infrastructure projects, and long-term agreements now confronts enforcement that does not negotiate timelines. Competing powers reassess their exposure when administration replaces partnership. Debt loses its patience when assets are deemed too strategic to remain unstable. The contest is not ideological in the way past conflicts were framed. It is procedural. It is about who ultimately enforces outcomes when alignment fractures. The United States take control of Venezuela clarifies that the struggle is not between competing visions of society, but between methods of control. One method entangles gradually, embedding influence through dependency. Another appears at the end of the cycle, when ambiguity becomes intolerable and secures the result directly. The effect is not balance, but compression. Options narrow. Neutrality evaporates. Alignment becomes mandatory rather than chosen. The United States take control of Venezuela sharpens this reality without ever explaining it explicitly, because explanation is no longer required. The system understands itself. The United States take control of Venezuela implicates the collective not because it is unprecedented, but because it is legible. The mechanisms are familiar, even if the outcome feels extreme. Many societies already exist within thresholds where policy space is conditional, where budgets are supervised, where compliance is rewarded and deviation punished. What differs here is visibility. Administration is no longer abstract. The hand is seen. The language remains technical, managerial, procedural. There are no grand speeches about empire, no ideological manifestos. There's only the quiet assertion that stability requires intervention, that order must be maintained, that assets must be protected. The United States take control of Venezuela shows that the future of power does not require persuasion once dependency has done its work. It requires execution. And execution arrives only after normalization has stripped the situation of urgency. By the time control becomes visible, resistance has already been framed as irresponsibility. The United States take control of Venezuela forces a reconsideration of what sovereignty means in a financialized world. Sovereignty is no longer absolute authority over territory. It is conditional access to systems of capital, trade, and security. It survives only as long as it aligns with dominant structures. When alignment fails, sovereignty is reinterpreted as a risk factor rather than a right. Administration is justified as mitigation. Control is justified as stewardship. The United States take control of Venezuela reveals the endpoint of a path many states are already walking, often willingly, often unknowingly. The realization does not arrive as panic. It arrives as clarity. Power is not hidden because it is secret. It is hidden because it is ordinary. It operates through contracts rather than conquest, through ratings rather than rhetoric, through procedures rather than proclamations. The United States take control of Venezuela returns the question to the audience not as accusation, but as implication. How many nations would recognize the moment when sovereignty turns into service? How many would name it before the transition is complete? The pattern thrives on delay, on the belief that adaptation equals safety. But adaptation, extended over time, becomes compliance. Compliance becomes administration. Administration becomes control. The United States take control of Venezuela reveals that the most dangerous phase is not collapse, but normalization. Collapse provokes reaction. Normalization dissolves resistance. By the time the structure is visible, it is already defended by necessity. The United States take control of Venezuela does not demand outrage. It demands awareness. The United States take control of Venezuela closes the circle by dismantling one final comfort, the belief that empires ended when the language changed. Empires were never dismantled. They were redesigned. Control did not disappear. It professionalized. It learned to speak the language of efficiency, to justify itself as rescue, to frame permanence as transition. History advances not by abolishing power, but by renaming it. The United States take control of Venezuela is not prophecy and not spectacle. It is confirmation. The headlines will fade. The administration will be normalized. The vocabulary will shift. The pattern will persist because it functions within the logic of the system that sustains it. Watch where obligations accumulate. Watch where assets concentrate. Watch where options narrow quietly rather than collapse loudly. That is where the next threshold forms. Stay inside the analysis. Remain attentive to the moments when management replaces consent. Follow the path where money, power, and history converge. The United States take control of Venezuela.